A charity has warned that nearly 250,000 vulnerable adults in England and Wales each year are not being offered the support of an appropriate adult in police custody. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, said the situation was unacceptable.
It's now 22 minutes to 9. People who are mentally ill or are vulnerable because of a disability have been entitled for the last 30 years or so to have with them someone known, and it is a technical term, as an appropriate adult if they're detained or are being questioned by police, to make sure that they're fairly treated and know their rights. But the system seems to be creaking. A charity working with such people says that 250,000 people a year are not getting that kind of assistance to which they're entitled. Chris Bath is Chief Executive of the National Appropriate Adult Network and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
That's an extraordinarily high figure. I'm sure it's one that will surprise people.
Yeah, well, it was interesting to me, actually. What we looked at in the research was the general data that was out there around the prevalence of things like mental disorders and learning disabilities, specifically in police custody, work that had been done previously. And then we asked police forces to give us data on how many people from their databases were getting appropriate adults. And you know, it was about 22% of the adult population going through police custody who need an appropriate adult.
Really, nearly a quarter.
Yep, and police reported to us that they had on their system showing about 3% of the adults going through custody. So it's potentially an absolutely huge amount of people.
Well, what it means is that 250,000 people don't have an appropriate adult when they're entitled to one, and only about 45,000 do.
Correct.
In other words, it's skewed the wrong way. What is the evidence that this system works, in the sense that the police understand it and can work with it well? I mean, is it clearly something that does work?
Yeah, I mean, when it's present, it works. So one of the things that we looked at in the report, again, was the percentages of adults who are identified as being mentally vulnerable. In the police forces that can rely on appropriate adult services being available throughout their force area, which may be a few local authorities, they were 5 times more likely to identify mental vulnerability than those forces who had no organised appropriate adult services in their entire force area. And of course, if you talk to mentally vulnerable people about their experience in custody, they often feel obviously lonely, but they also feel confused, not understanding what's happening.
Yeah.
And many of the consequences don't come to light until many years later.
Who is allowed to be named an appropriate adult in these circumstances?
So it's absolutely fine for a carer, anybody who's over 18 who's basically not involved.
A family member?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. But of course, many of the individuals who have mental health conditions, etc., they're actually maybe estranged from families, or actually, you know, you may feel that you don't, as an individual, particularly want your family directly involved in the fact that you've been to a police station.
And at that point, are the police under an obligation to help you find someone if you can demonstrate that you need some assistance or some protection?
Yeah, if the police have any suspicion or are told in good faith that a person may be mentally vulnerable, they have to, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act Codes of Practice, secure an appropriate adult.
And they do.
Well, the difficulty, and this is where my sympathy goes out to the police, is that what do you do if there isn't a scheme that you can quickly call up and contact? And what we found from the report was a number of survival mechanisms for custody sergeants, one of which was, you know, perhaps to deal unofficially with the vulnerability rather than recording it. And another one is, in certain circumstances, having to go out and ask random members of the public to fulfil the role.
Interesting. Chris Bath, thank you.
C5 Live.
And it's 6 o'clock, it's 5 Live Breakfast with Rachel Bird. And our top news story, thousands of vulnerable people are being questioned by police without the support of an appropriate adult.
Our top sports story this morning, Farah stumbles through in Beijing, but Celtic stumble out of the Champions League.
And 5 Live Sports Extra this evening will have coverage of the T20 in the Women's Ashes.
This is BBC 5 Live.
We'll begin with the news from Mike Young.
250,000 vulnerable people in England and Wales are being questioned by police without the right support. A report commissioned by the Home Office says officers often go ahead without an appropriate adult because of shortage of awareness and trained volunteers. Chris Bath is the Chief Executive of the National Appropriate Adult Network.
Police seem to really be struggling to identify mentally vulnerable people. It looks like around a quarter to a fifth of people flowing through police custody are actually mentally vulnerable, and the police seem to be identifying about 3% rather than sort of 20 to 25% of those people. So we need the police to do better at that.
And the time is 6:07. Good morning. Now we begin with the story that 250,000 vulnerable people a year in England and Wales are not getting the help they are entitled to while in police custody. Now these are people with learning disabilities, mental illness, or those on the autistic spectrum. And they should have what is known as an appropriate adult with them to make sure that they are fairly treated. But the National Appropriate Adult Network, which led a study for the Home Office, says that only happens in around 1 in 6 cases. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford, can tell us more. Morning, Daniel.
Good morning.
What is the problem here? Is it that the individuals themselves don't know what they're entitled to, or that the police are not identifying who needs help?
Well, there are two problems. The first of all, that the police don't seem to be identifying enough of the people who need this kind of help. These are people who might be mentally ill or have some other kind of mental vulnerability, which might mean that they might either not understand the process of what's going on around them, might not understand their rights. But also there are a risk of things like a false confession. They're people that need to have somebody sitting with them as they go through the process in the police station of being detained and questioned. So often the police are not identifying their needs, but also when the police do identify their needs, then there isn't really a proper network of these so-called appropriate adults in some areas, so that when the police feel they do need one of them, they can't really get hold of one. And one of the issues is that for children, there is a statutory requirement for local authorities to provide appropriate adults for children, but that doesn't exist for these mentally vulnerable adults.
And who is an appropriate adult? Because we're not necessarily talking about a solicitor here, are we?
We're very much not talking about a solicitor. It's completely separate from any kind of a legal advisor. It's somebody who can sit with the prisoner and advise them on simple things like whether they can ask for a solicitor, for example, and just to make sure that they're being treated properly. And very often it's frankly a family member or a friend. It can be something as simple as that, someone to sit with somebody, or it can be a trained volunteer. And in many areas there are networks of trained volunteers who provide this service, just members of the public who feel that they can help in this area, or it can be a social worker or a charity worker. And the debate is how should these networks work? And I think there's a growing consensus that what there needs to be is a proper organised network of trained volunteers in every area so that this service can be provided properly.
And is there evidence that the course of justice is not being followed properly as a result of a lack of these appropriate adults?
Well, there is limited evidence. One of the problems is that the police don't keep proper data about when they seek an appropriate adult and when they don't. But the whole reason why this appropriate adult system was set up was because there had been some very high profile cases where people had made false confessions. They had admitted that they'd done a crime which it later turned out that they simply could not have committed. And that was really why this whole system was set up, and why there's a concern that if it isn't made to work properly, there could be much more serious miscarriages of justice in future too.
So what are the police and Home Office saying about it?
Well, I think everybody understands and agrees that this needs to be sorted out. The Home Secretary said that this was an unacceptable situation and she was looking to try and work out what can be done about it. But of course, this is a money issue. The money needs to be found and the training needs to be done. But the National Appropriate Adults Network, who did this research, says actually it would cost about £19 million to ensure proper provision right across England and Wales. So it's not an enormous sum of money.
Thank you. Daniel Sanford, who's our Home Affairs correspondent.
This is BBC Radio 2. At 8 o'clock, here's Maura.
BBC News at 8 o'clock on Wednesday, the 26th of August. Good morning. A charity warns that vulnerable people in police custody are not getting the proper support. Nearly 250,000 vulnerable adults in England and Wales are not being offered the support of an appropriate adult while in police custody. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, said the situation was unacceptable. Here's Daniel Sanford.
Appropriate adults, as they're called, are supposed to protect the rights of mentally vulnerable people being held or questioned by the police. They're there to ensure fair treatment and to guard against false confessions. They may be friends or family members or specially trained members of the public, but a report by the charity the National Appropriate Adults Network has estimated that around 250,000 vulnerable people aged 18 or over a year do not get an appropriate adult when they should have one. This is because of a shortage of trained people in some areas, but also because many police officers fail to recognise when one is needed.
Now, being questioned by the police is a daunting experience for anyone. But this morning, a charity has warned that nearly 250,000 vulnerable adults in England and Wales are not being offered the support of an appropriate adult while in police custody. Under 18s and those who have mental health issues or learning difficulties are legally required to have someone assigned to them to help them through the process. We'll hear about the situation in Wiltshire shortly, but first, Grev Wallington is from the National Appropriate Adult Network, the charity that's led the study that's out today. He explained to me earlier why this is a problem.
The service provision throughout England and Wales is patchy, to say the least, and so there are often lengthy delays in securing an appropriate adult by the police or somebody coming to the police station. That is only going to exaggerate and somebody's mental health problems or vulnerabilities in the police station and cause delay for the process itself.
What are the reasons for this lack of support? Is it a lack of people volunteering, a lack of money, a lack of time maybe?
It's a mixed thing. I think historically that the main problem has been is that, as you said, that there's a legal responsibility on the police to have an appropriate adult presence for certain parts of the stay in custody for somebody from these groups. On the other side, there's no responsibility on anyone to provide these services. And whilst social services do run a number of services and effective services across the country, the simple fact is that in these times of increased financial pressure, service directors are looking at where they can make savings, and if they don't have a legal duty to do it, then they're cutting the services out.